The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Very sad news that relates to a bigger issue that we don't often have the opportunity to talk about, which is that former Red Sox player David Ortiz, who, if you don't follow baseball or don't live in Boston, maybe you don't even know about. I don't know how well David Ortiz, Pat, is known like outside of the baseball world. Maybe he's not that well known. I don't know.
I think he's somewhat well known because he's such a big character. He's definitely the best designated hitter of all time, and certainly a Red Sox legend. Everyone in Boston knows him.
Absolutely. He is from the Dominican Republic, and he is recovering after he was shot in a bar on Sunday night in the Dominican Republic, according to multiple reports, including media speaking to David Ortiz's dad. He was at the Dial Bar and Lounge in Santo Domingo. He was brought to a local hospital, reportedly ambushed by a man who got off of a motorcycle, went up to Ortiz and shot him in the back at close to point-blank range before 9 p.m. local time. The bullet went in through David Ortiz's back and exited through his stomach. David Ortiz is 43, and he reportedly told the emergency room doctor, "Please don't let me die. I'm a good man," before going into surgery. The believed perpetrator is in custody, was captured and actually beaten up by people who were at the bar before police eventually showed up and arrested him. And he is also getting treatment at a local hospital. So this is, I mean, okay, first of all, it's on a very practical level. I'm kind of surprised, Pat, that David Ortiz, given his finances, doesn't actually travel with security in general when he's in public. That actually is a bit surprising to me.
Yeah, that is true. I'm sure he's one of the most famous people living in the Dominican Republic, so you'd think that he would have a few bodyguards around him. But even so, would that have prevented the shooting? Not necessarily.
Not.
I mean, I'm sure he just let his guard down being out in public that night.
It's totally possible. And then the bigger thing is that there does seem to be a growing issue of, I know, I'm going to give a bunch of caveats in a second. I'm reading more and more about the Dominican Republic becoming more and more dicey when it comes to safety. And I am really hesitant. Number one, David Ortiz may have been specifically targeted as a wealthy, famous person. We don't know. And that can happen anywhere, regardless of whether a country, generally speaking, is safe or unsafe. That's number one. Number two, I really hesitate to make these broad claims about a country is safe or a country is dangerous because it is often, number one, very localized in terms of specific parts. I mean, look at the U.S. There are parts of the U.S. that are what we would call dangerous and parts that are extraordinarily safe. And to characterize an entire country one way or the other, I hesitate to do. It's also often very racialized. And I think that that's why it's important to be careful when we talk about danger or safety. But this reminds me of the fact that a number of friends have recently sent me articles indicating that increasingly tourists are being targeted in the Dominican Republic. And this is one of the reasons. I've never been to the DR, but when I go to a place, and you know this because you've been to the Yucatan area around Cancun, Pat, and so have I. When I go to a place, I don't want to be stuck at a resort, and I don't want to have to stay away from the real place. And the last time I was in Cancun was many, many years ago. And I went to the actual downtown, and at the hotel, they would say, you know, most tourists don't go there. And I would say, is it unsafe? And they would say, no, it's not unsafe. It's just, number one, you've got to speak Spanish, really, which is fine. I do. And you've got to be comfortable on the local public transit. And most tourists don't go. Now, Cancun has become much more dangerous for tourists or people who are notably not from there outside of the touristy areas. And that has kept me from going to the Dominican Republic because my understanding is that a lot of the places in which the big resorts are, where you get the nice beaches and whatnot, if you leave the resort, it's not particularly safe.
Yeah, I feel like, though, you shouldn't make this story make you even more scared off by visiting, because it seems as if David Ortiz was specifically targeted.
Yeah.
And the odd thing is we don't necessarily know the motive yet. Like, initially it was reported as a robbery attempt. So that would make sense as to what the motive would be. Perpetrator goes out trying to attack someone who was obviously very wealthy and well-known to get some money. Now we just don't know. I mean, it certainly wasn't a random shooting. David Ortiz was specifically targeted, but we don't exactly know the reason why. Given the fact that it was a celebrity who was targeted, that wouldn't make me think that the overall crime rate is anything particularly worse than, you know, any other part of that part of the world.
That's exactly right. This one incident is not evidence that it is particularly safe, unsafe, or that the safety level of the Dominican Republic has changed. Dominican Republic is certainly not one of the places that is on the State Department's list where they say, you're not even really going to be able to get help from American authorities, embassy or consulate. We can't, you really shouldn't go. It's not Syria, for example. It's not the parts of Mexico that are designated as so dangerous because of cartel activity that the State Department says don't go. But they are areas of elevated threat. And I know that there are people who enjoy going to those areas in particular. There's sort of, I forget what it's called, not danger tourism, but I forget the name. There's a certain phrase that's applied to it. That's not my thing. And as a result, I do stay away from places that are marked in that way. But I hope that I do make it to the Dominican Republic eventually. Have you been to the DR?
No, I haven't. The only part of Latin America that I visited has been Mexico, which I went to earlier this year.
Right.
That danger tourism thing, that's bizarre to me. Like, I get the adrenaline rush of like wanting to go climb a mountain that may be dangerous or like skydiving, right? Because then you get a thrill out of that. I don't necessarily connect with this idea of going to a very high crime area and just trying to survive. Like, I don't think that would send me like the same adrenaline rush. I would certainly be nervous the entire time, but like I wouldn't get off on it. Like I wouldn't be very happy about it.
Yeah, it's not my thing either. And there are lots of video blogs on YouTube of people who will figure out how to go drive around Syria. They'll go to a border country that's easier to get to from the U.S. and then they will sort of sneak in or get in because they want to see, what it's like or different places. But it is certainly not my thing. But David Ortiz, to get back to the main story, it seems like he's going to make it. He is recovering, and that's good, but just horrible, horrible story. Another Boston story. The city of Boston is now saying that it cannot stop the straight pride parade that is planned for this summer just because people disagree with the values of the organizers. This is according to the Boston mayor, Marty Walsh, and there's a whole series of tweets in which the straight pride parade was criticized, but Walsh said that if they get permits or they ask for permits, the permits are granted on the basis of what they call operational feasibility, not values or endorsement of beliefs. And that it would be, listen, we talk, Pat, about free speech and when free speech arguments are not at issue and when they are. For a city, if there is not anything criminal going on, if it doesn't get to the point of being direct incitement to violence or whatever, for a city to say, we are going to award or not award permits on the basis of how we like or dislike the values espoused, it would be a government, a city government, suppressing the speech, the right of people to peaceably assemble.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that this straight pride group should be able to have their stupid parade because, that is freedom of speech, that is freedom of assembly, and that's just called America. We just kind of have to deal with it. The thing is, though, it would be best, I think, if this didn't get that much attention.
Right.
Because I feel like if this wasn't really reported, maybe 15 or 20 people would show up to the straight pride parade.
To protest it or to participate in it?
No, to participate in it.
Really? Oh,
but
I think that more than that would show up.
Well, I think because it's getting so much news attention, that's going to cause a bunch of other assholes to come in from throughout the country to also participate in the straight pride parade.
That may be
and it's just going to blow up into something much larger than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, I'm mixed between the best thing is for it to be completely ignored and whether it's 15 or 150 or even 500 people, that it is just completely ignored. It gets no attention and that's it, period. That would be sort of one side. The other side would be, Boston is one of the most LGBT-friendly cities in the country. Yes, there are lots of retrograde folks who work in Boston, who either live in Boston or live in the outskirts, who are not the most LGBT-friendly individuals. There is this streak of retrograde stuff, even in the very blue state of Massachusetts. But in Boston, you have to assume that the straight pride parade is going to be counter-protested in such a way that I can't imagine the straight pride parade is going to be, the participants are going to feel super comfortable. And I go back and forth between that's better than ignoring it, or it should just be ignored altogether.
But like, what's even the argument that the protesters are going to make?
Well,
right?
It's similar to the following. You know how on the Joe Rogan program, there was this thing about how Steven Crowder's shirt says socialism is for figs. And we were sort of going back and forth about like, listen, there's the letter of something and there's the spirit of it. And the letter of a straight pride parade is if LGBT people can have pride in their sexuality, then straight people should similarly be able to celebrate their heterosexuality. But it's sort of like when you talk about a white pride group on a white student union on a campus. Okay, I get it. You can make an argument based on the letter that a Hispanic student alliance is no different than a white student alliance. But once we actually all get away from pretending like we're just arguing about the letter and we understand the spirit and we understand the reason why a desire for these minority-based groups rose, and we recognize that straight people, white people, Christian people, there's no historical oppression of them in the United States. They are the agent identities when it comes to race or sexuality or sexual orientation, whatever. Then we sort of understand, like, listen, the association with this is not about straight pride per se. The idea of it is to push back against an event that is meant to recognize that there is a group that has been historically oppressed here.
That's exactly right. You have to look at the historical context. LGBT people throughout history have been marginalized. And so, there was a movement made out of trying to counter that, to make sure that those people feel proud about who they are as people. It's not like you have that same context when it comes to straight people. Straight people have always been thought of as, the norm, as people should be, right? So there's no need to make sure that pride in oneself is emphasized if you are a straight person, because it's just kind of thought of as the rule of thumb, right?
Well,
and the same thing goes for white people and
with the LGBT pride parade or whatever. The whole idea in my mind is this is a group that has been historically oppressed by individuals. It's a group that's been oppressed by the law and still is in many states where you can get fired for your actual or perceived sexual orientation. So the idea is a show of solidarity that despite all of that stuff, we are overcoming many of the obstacles legally, and it's a show of support for a group that says, hey, and I hope you think it's okay, and we're going to continue fighting for legal rights. Heterosexuals have never been oppressed. They have never been the targets of any of this stuff. So, like, what are we saying to rally around them and say, we are prideful about you being heterosexual? It's not that there's anything wrong with being heterosexual. I'm heterosexual. I've been heterosexual my entire life. It's perfectly great. But nothing would drive me to pick that as my identity that I want to go out and tout and celebrate pride in, because there's no historical context that would make that logical.
You know how sometimes you talk about how conservative messaging is a lot better than liberal messaging?
Yeah.
Like conservatives will talk about how we want small government and less taxes, and then that's kind of an easy thing to get people to wrap their head around. It's an easy thing to argue because it's the type of thing you can put on a bumper sticker and people sort of intuitively get it. Whereas the progressive argument, you often have to like go into detail and describe the nuances of things and historical context. I think this is very, very similar. Whereas someone who is participating in a straight pride parade, they could easily come out there and say, well, I'm straight. I'm happy being heterosexual. This is my life. I feel proud about it. What's wrong with that? And yeah, on the surface, maybe nothing's wrong with that, but you'd have to like delve into like a few bullet points as to why their thinking is flawed or why you may think that they're participating in this conversation in bad faith. And when you have to, have a debate on those terms, when they can fit their slogan on a bumper sticker and you have to go into detail, it's not good for our side on an optics level.
That's right.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the other thing that's going on here is everybody pretends like they don't understand anything, like they just understand. Nobody knows anything. Nobody can infer anything. It's the same thing as what's wrong with a shirt that says socialism is for figs. Figs are a type of fruit. Do we all have to pretend to be stupid? Because basically you have to pretend to be stupid in order to buy that as a reasonable sort of argument. And that's, I think, a lot of what is going on here. Hopefully the parade ends up not happening because of lack of interest, and we'll see ultimately what takes place. Okay, people have been writing saying, David, what's the next thing now that you've been on the Joe Rogan show? What is it that we can do to continue helping to grow the profile of the David Pakman Show? So a few different things. Number one, keep watching and refreshing the Rogan interview. It passed 1 million views last night, and it's now getting close to 1.1 million views. The more views my sense is that if doing an interview with me does better for Joe Rogan than some of the other interviews he's done, it's more likely that he would have me back. As an example, the interview he did the same day that I was on the Joe Rogan program with some MMA guy who seems super nice and like a great guy. But the reality is that interview has only about half the views that my interview with Joe Rogan had. If we can keep pumping up the number of views, it's going to make it more likely that I or other progressives get invited back. And that's a really good thing for piercing, new audiences that may not be exposed to some of our ideas. When you do this, please go to YouTube and actually search for Joe Rogan, David Pakman. Right now, when you type in Joe Rogan space, my name, as in the search term Joe Rogan, David Pakman, comes up like 5th or 6th when I do it. And this is based on an algorithm. The more you search for Joe Rogan, David Pakman, the more YouTube will suggest David Pakman when people type in Joe Rogan. That's a really good thing. Where is it coming up for you, Pat? I don't know if you're checking that right now.
If I search Joe Rogan, David Pakman?
If you start typing into Google, to YouTube rather, Joe Rogan space, and then it'll drop down a few common searches. Where is mine even coming up?
No, unfortunately not. I think that could take time before it happens. I'm seeing Alex Jones, Experience, Ben Shapiro, Kevin Hart.
Got it.
Elon
Okay,
Musk.
yeah. So when I search, I'm seeing the same ones that Pat is mentioning, plus mine, but that may be based on the algorithm. Keep searching for that. Keep watching the video, comment, etc. Number 2, I think it would be great to try now to push for Sam Harris to interview me, okay? And there's a very specific reason why I think that would be a good idea. Sam Harris's audience, once again, is one that certainly has sympathies ideologically that may not be in line with those that I hold in total or those of our audience, but it is an audience that I consider to be possibly reachable and merely by exposure will help to grow the David Pakman Show significantly. So I think that given that Sam Harris has been on Joe Rogan's program, and given that Sam Harris is aware of our show because he has retweeted a couple of the things that we've done, this is a great time to say, hey, Sam, Joe Rogan interviewed David Pakman. You should really have him on your podcast. I think that could be a really great opportunity for the show.
And I've tried reaching out before. I think his Waking Up with Sam Harris website has a contact page. Maybe the audience can help try to reach out and try to put your name out there as well. Yep. I haven't been so lucky as to get a response from his team yet, but in mass, if we do this and we mention Joe Rogan's name, there's a good chance of it happening.
Yep, I think that as many people as can tweet to Sam Harris, hey, Sam, did you see David Pakman on Joe Rogan's show? Here's a link. Please, please, please invite David Pakman. I think that that's a good thing. And then lastly, I think that it would be great to try to get the David Pakman Show on Alexa, where if people say to Alexa, hey, play the David Pakman Show, that it will do it. There are other shows that have done it. I think you need some actual tech developer skills. You need to understand the Amazon developer platform and some other stuff. We don't know anything about that. If somebody knows about how to get our content so that Alexa will know exactly what to go to when people ask about it, please get in touch. That's something we could work on. Okay, that does it for today. Thanks to all of our new members, including everybody who has signed up since my appearance on the Joe Rogan program. New show, new bonus show tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.